today's class, we discussed Michel Foucault and his idea of the episteme, or the application of power in a normalizing way to essentially get everyone to behave a certain way without having to force them to do it. You don't have to have an authority figure to enforce power. People do it to themselves. Foucault was not the only thinker to come up with ideas like this. In the United States, we had a man by the name of Thomas Stearns Kuhn, who was looking at the progression of science. And what he discovered, or what he wrote about in 1962 in a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, which is extremely influential, what he wrote about was the way science progresses and the way it doesn't progress the way most people assume. Most of us have taken science classes, and somewhere along the line we've learned that at some point in history the wheel was invented, and from there it's been a straight line all the way to modern quantum physics. That's not the way Kuhn saw it. What he noticed was that scientific advancements would happen, then there would be nothing happening for a very long time, or even a step backwards. So for example, after the Greeks, the Middle Ages were actually a step back. They didn't recover what the Greeks and the Romans had had. So it took 1,000 years for us to get back to square one. So Kuhn asked himself why it was that this was happening. And then he started to look at the way science itself works. He looked at the structure of science, and he discovered something about it. And it's very similar to what we've been talking about so far. We've been discussing mythologies. Again, Foucault calls them something else, but again, they are essentially the stories that we tell to understand the world around us. And we've already talked about the fact that many of them are contradictory. We've already talked about the fact that some of them are hyper-real. We've discussed how these things work. Now we get to add something totally new to the equation. Kuhn said, sciences do exactly what the rest of society does. There is a system of normalizing behavior within the science. So, for example, if you're a physicist, you see the world through a physicist's eyes. Chemists see it through chemist's eyes. But even within chemistry, there are all kinds of assumptions that go with it. In biology, there are all kinds of assumptions that go with it. For example, the whole idea of medicine, what is healthy, what is normal, these things keep changing. You'll notice in the news they'll tell you something like, well, for example, just recently, that drinking wine will actually now kill you. A couple of years ago, it was that a couple of glasses of wine a week would be good for you. Guess what? It changes over time. And so the ideas within the field change, and what is acceptable within the field changes. Now, when it changes very, very radically, the field actually collapses in on itself. And the way Kuhn understood this, he basically called the process of normal science, that is, the length of time that a particular scientific field holds a particular reign, he called that a paradigm. And he called the process of the breakdown of that paradigm a paradigm shift. And what happens after a paradigm shift is everything sort of reverts back to zero, and ideas get thrown out again, and suddenly new ideas have a chance to catch hold. So he gives a very particular example of this in his book. The example that Kuhn gives is the example of astronomy, where we went from what was called the Ptolemaic model of the universe to the Copernican model. In the Ptolemaic model, the Earth was at the center of the universe. Now, in order to make that work, you had to sort of accept the fact that there was this weird wobble to everything that surrounded the Earth. And the way to make this work was to, again, picture a series of boxes upon boxes upon boxes where things were hanging above the Earth. And all this sounds very silly to a modern ear, but in fact it made perfect sense at the time. And there were really intelligent people who were measuring, who were doing all kinds of things, predicting, doing all of the things that modern scientists do, but they were basically doing it in a model that doesn't actually reflect reality. And so it didn't work. At some point, a scientist by the name of Galileo, and I'm sure this is a sort of a throwback to your grade school, but at some point Galileo pointed out, hey, this isn't making sense. If you simply shift the Earth from being the center to being an orbiting planet around the sun, everything starts to make much, much more sense. And once that happened, and it took a while, the lights turned on. And by the way, notice it's not called the Galilean model, it's the Copernican model, because that was such a radical difference. And we'll talk about that in a couple minutes, that in fact it wasn't accepted by Galileo's culture. Okay? But this idea that this giant shift happened, that's fascinating. Look at this image. I don't know which one you see, but it can be seen as two things. It can either be a duck or it can be a rabbit. The funny part about it is that it can only be seen as one or the other. You have to shift your focus completely in order to see the other. And then when you do, so if you're seeing a duck and you force yourself to see the rabbit, then you can't see the duck anymore, and vice versa. Okay. Now you can shift back and forth, but you can't see them both at the same time. That's an example of a shift in paradigm. Okay, so that's kind of an interesting and crucial point to keep in mind. Okay, as we wrap up our discussion today, let's go back to why we don't call it the Galilean model and why we call it the Copernican model. And to do that, we are going to go back a little bit to Foucault and the idea of how power is normalized, how it's distributed, who gets to wield it. And what's interesting about the paradigm idea is that we are talking about it as, this is the process, but guess what? People get invested in the process. They start making it part of other structures that are in fact very relevant to the society. So astronomy doesn't sound like it's one of those things, but in fact, it's kind of crucial to how you understand our place in the universe. If you were brought up with the idea that God created the heavens and the earth, and he put at the very center of it humanity, then it kind of makes sense that the earth would be at the center of the universe. So what you have is an astronomical model, which by the way predates Christianity, but that corroborates a Christian worldview. Please don't make the mistake here of assuming that theologically it's required. It's not. You can be a practicing Christian without having to believe that the earth is at the center of the universe. But it was a structure, a paradigm, that corroborated another paradigm, at least in the minds of those people who were in charge at the time. So Galileo is living in Italy, it's controlled by the Catholic Church, and the idea of moving the earth out of the center of the universe seems to shake the foundation of a lot of other things besides astronomy. And so Galileo is forced to recant. He is forced to say that his very, very accurate observation is in fact false doctrine, and he is essentially locked away for the rest of his life, at least kept from practicing his profession. Okay? And so it's another part of the world, and Copernicus in Poland, who is eventually able to actually make this whole process work. Okay? So the idea that the paradigm is something that people are invested in is kind of an important point to also consider. Again, think about the mythologies, think about the epistemes. There is an element of ownership to that and investment in it, so that when you start questioning it, it's very, very threatening. This is something else you might want to consider as you are coming up with your own paper topics. And are we not willing to protect our paradigms, our beliefs, our mythologies? And are we not willing to deviate a little bit from properly rational thought in order to do so? If you remember in class when we were talking about critical thinking, I mentioned, or I asked the class, how many of you have argued a point even though you knew you were wrong? And I gave the example of course, if you're in a relationship with someone, will you argue against them even if you know you're wrong? And about half the class raised their hands. And I'm guessing the other half just didn't want to admit that that's what they were doing. So now imagine that you're doing that on the level of sort of fundamental beliefs. Earlier I gave the example of that Soviet economist. Can you imagine having invested your life's ambition in studying something in school, getting a degree in it, working your way up into a profession, and then only to have it all come crashing down around you. This is not a happy moment in a person's life. So the idea of paradigm shift, which sounds very innocuous, is in fact a major, major blow and a major transition. The destruction of a paradigm opens up a very creative space for new ideas to develop. But that kind of chaos cannot sustain itself for very long, and a new paradigm always builds up in its place. That goes a long way towards our other ideas. Mythologies exist in this very creative space. When they start to fall apart, when their internal paradoxes start to appear, we come up with all kinds of other ways of explaining away what's happening. And so you'll have myth A, myth B, myth C, all the way down to myth Z, and they're all interacting with each other as people are trying to come up with a new way of explaining how their world works. Hopefully, this discussion will help you as you start to think about your own paper topics. Again, you can approach this from the Foucault perspective, you can approach it from the Solomon perspective of mythologies, and you can approach it from the T.S. Kuhn avenue of looking at paradigms. Any one of them will work, and I'm kind of hoping that you'll bring your own creativity into it. I think one of the great moments for any student is when they realize that what they're studying is actually open to some kind of discussion and interpretation. It's not all received gospel from the professor in front of the classroom. And I realize it's very ironic for a professor to be telling you that, but it's kind of an interesting point to consider. All right, so I will see you in class. Start working on your papers and have a great weekend.